Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We are week 3 right now, kind of cruising along. Hopefully, you're having a great time in class, kind of learning a lot, processing a lot of information, and I hope your things are going well. If you have any questions, let me know for sure, as always. This week is kind of backing off the articles. We're not kind of doing any articles this week, but rather kind of having some applications. There's a podcast that is about race and the culture industries. I think it's a really powerful, interesting, informative podcast. And then you have an option of one of 3 different films: Sneakerheads, um, Plain Unfair, and Latinos Beyond Real. So we're going to talk about all 3 of the, talk about the assignment for this week, or talk about the podcast and the films, and also provide a little bit of background and context just summary over the last few weeks, and then give you the question for this particular week for your write up. So that's kind of like the game plan. All right. So first of all, where we've been so far is really just kind of going over theories of sociology and their application to popular culture. So at this point, you should feel pretty comfortable with functionalism, conflict theory, interactionism, the main ideas of those theories. These are the 3 main branches of sociology. And it gets pretty complicated pretty fast. There's a lot of different. You see, like there's 1, 2, and 3, the 3 main umbrellas of sociology. So we treat them as these 3 separate things, which they are. But there's a lot of tributaries and overlap that are sort of these nuanced theories that come out. Social theory is very dynamic. We're only covering these 3 main branches, but there's a host of theories and perspectives that are out there. I like to think of these theories as vantage points, perspectives, things to shape the ways in which we our questions or our investigation when we're looking at something. And it's basically like putting on a pair of glasses, right? So we want to look at some phenomena or some issue, and we put on the functionalist glasses. If we put on the functionalist glasses, we're asking a different set of questions than if we're going to be putting on a conflict theory set of glasses or interactionist set of glasses. So there's not one theory is right or wrong. There are different ways of viewing the world and different evidence and different perspectives to be gathered by looking at the world through those lenses. So let me kind of talk a little bit about the 3 theories as applied to a couple different phenomena. So maybe make it a little bit more concrete as far as these 3 theories, or just reaffirm what you already know, and then talk about the assignment for this particular week. Okay, so let's talk, so functionalism, some general ideas is that it's about society stability. A consensus of values is really important for societal stability. It's looking for order. The belief from a functionalist perspective is that societies respond. They're problem-solving entities. So if there's something going on in society that's creating too much dysfunction or too much discord, society kind of solves that problem. It's a very idealistic viewpoint and perspective and theory. A lot of these theories, we talk about, like what I just mentioned, sort of this idea about society is a problem-solving entity. It solves problems when if problems become too large. In its early foundations, functionalists believed that societies basically could be perfected or at least significantly improved upon. We talk about today in sociological theory, we talk about neo-functionalism, new functionalism. So some of the very ideas that go back to Durkheim or earlier, or maybe even early 1900s, mid-1900s, sociologists today see that those ideas, some of them are valuable, but some of them need to be reworked for contemporary societies. We talk about neo-functionalism. That distinction is not really all that important, other than to recognize there's an inherent limitation of functionalism, and that is that it doesn't account for issues of inequality and power. That's always one of its limitations of how it views things. So from a functionalist viewpoint, right, so what we see and what's represented in the media would be something that's a consensus of the public's values, their interest, what they want to engage in and what they want to see. Well, I mean, there's some truth to that. So it's not that there's no truth to that the audience, does not, the audience does have some influence on what is there. But it minimizes or doesn't take into account the structures, the culture industry itself, the demographics within the industry, and the logic of the industry, a logic that's based on a model of capitalism. So these things are going to start to put pressure points on the institution and then on representations themselves. And functionalism doesn't do a really good job of addressing that. Conflict theory, that's its focus, right? So conflict theory focuses on the issue of power, inequity. You could look at gender, race, class, other areas of difference, and look at how issues of representation within the culture industries, how the culture industries represent different groups, and not only that they represent them in very particular ways, but why, the logic behind it, and the impact. And I think those are some things that are often forgotten, is like conflict theory is a really powerful theory to start to address areas of representation and why these areas of representation become problematic for society itself, because they're reinforcing not only structured inequality, but a larger system of production, of capitalist production, or of production that's leading to particular inequities. One of the limitations of conflict theory is that it's not looking for those places of unity, like looking for those places of consensus building. And it's not a limitation. I mean, it's a limitation of the theory. It's important to understand the limitations of these theories, but it's not necessarily a weakness of the theory in the sense that that's not the scope, or that's not the original intent of the examination of the theory. The functionalism was never designed to sort of look at those areas of inequalities. It was designed to sort of look at society through a little bit different lens. Conflict theory, the same thing. I mean, it's not looking for the areas of unity and why we have them. It's looking for more examining sort of the impact of an economic structure, in our case, in contemporary society, of the impact of capitalism and particular forms of capitalism on things such as the industry, the ideological industry, or the culture industry. And then finally is the interactionist perspective. The interactionist perspective has to do with meaning and perceptions, the process of making meaning, the process of developing perceptions, self-identity. These all become important things. Language, images, representations, those all become important things under the interactionist perspective. So let me kind of give you a couple different examples. Talk about sports. Okay, so sports from a functionalist perspective, and you read this in the reading already, so it's nothing new, but it's sort of the idea that sports becomes a potential for a lot of unity, right? People have an ownership into a team. They're an Oregon State fan, so they're a Beaver, or they're a University of Oregon, they're a Duck fan. There's a lot of unity around that. Collective effervescence if you go to a game or you go to an event that's to watch the game. But there's a lot of meaning going on there. The Olympics, a great time to talk about international community coming together, right? That sports become a powerful way to bring unity, to communicate values and ideals, to create solidarity in that regard as well. From looking at youth sports, when youth are in sports, right? It's an important way. One of the functions of sports is to be socialized, to learn values of team playing, leadership, self-development. A lot of positive things come out of sports. A lot of value comes out of sports. Shouldn't say positive, but a lot of value that provides a lot of contribution to society. Conflict theory looks at sports and examines areas of inequities that were within sports. So just kind of give a few. So for example, if you look at within football, let's look at the racial representation of coaches and managers and owners. And see, the further you go up the hierarchy, the more predominantly white the institution is, and it starts to ask the question, well, why is that? You can even break it down to the number of quarterbacks, or those who are who are defensive line, offensive line in different positions, which there's been studies of that before, and sort of how does that come to be that the football field of the players on the football field and their positions is a replication of larger society and issues of racial inequality. We can look at tennis and gender inequity in tennis. Serena Williams, powerful force within tennis, within women's tennis. There may be a race and class issue going on here and a gender issue going on here. But sometimes the way in which line judges or the regulation of female athletes, female tennis players compared to male tennis players may be a little bit different in terms of what umpires and line judges or umpires allow kind of the women tennis players to engage in terms of a bad call and their response to it, and how they may be addressed by the umpire may be different for a female athlete versus a male athlete. Title IX, gender equity and funding. I mean, a major transformation, right? And that came about because of a lot of hard work and dedication by those who are supportive of more gender equity in sports. So that was a major structural shift, and a lot of work went into forming that legislation, a lot of resistance. There's some that institutions didn't want to do that. They didn't want to engage in gender parity or gender equity in terms of sports. But major transformations as a result of leveling the playing field somewhat. So conflict theory is going to look at those areas of inequality that are going on, inequalities that are being expressed in various aspects of sports. NCAA and March Madness, NCAA and sports in general, the amount of money within sports. There's a lot of conflict theory. I think would examine that and say that there's a real economic thing going on here where these institutions of college sports and then of course ESPN and other sports networks are basically making a lot of money off these athletes. And they get a college education, they get some other things, but the amount of money that's being made from these athletes is incredible compared to the amount of returns that the athletes are getting from their play. So there's a lot of things you can sort of examine from that lens. And then the last part is looking at interactionist perspective and is looking at identities and meaning and perception and representations. So it could be that it's the ways in which we view something, right? So our social position, being your gender position, your class position, your race position may influence how you view something, right? So how someone sees, for example, use the example of looking at Kaepernick and protest and at the NFL and the 49ers. So a few years ago, more controversial, as far as the national anthem and sort of, Kaepernick not engaging in the national anthem and people's response to that. Well, their response to that and the way they think about that may be dependent upon a lot of different factors, right? It may depend upon race for sure, may have an influence over sort of how an individual perceives and interprets that particular event. Could be gender, class, race, all different kind of things may influence that. So one thing to consider is that it's your audience position or the position and the demographic of the individual that may influence how, may be a factor, right? A factor that influences how the person views something. The other part of that is just looking at representations, looking at images, looking at language and examining that and trying to understand sort of the power of that. So that's interactionism. So the idea for this week in the write-up is I want you to do a Google search and type in, or a search engine, whatever, doesn't matter to Google, right? But white teeth strips products. So those four words, white teeth strips products. And I want you to and then click on images and look at all the images, just look at images of these products and how they're being marketed. And then I want you to sort of develop, just sort of give your response of functionalism, conflict theory, interactionism, okay? Choose at least two of those theories. Which two theories do you think are most represented in in these white teeth products? So I want you to sort of give some examination of that. Sometimes think about popular culture, like we think about music and movies and sports and these kind of things. But it's also, it's consumption stuff, right? This is part of popular culture. It's something that's fascinating to look at because it's through our culture in which we get to understand issues of gender relations, class relations, race, religion, other aspects of social life. So it is a powerful way. It's through the products or it's through what we produce as humans that we can examine basically a lot of social things going on. Okay, so I just want to give just a few more minutes. I want to give you a little bit of information about the podcast on race and the culture industries, a couple things to introduce. I mean, these terms that the author uses may be unfamiliar to you, so I just want to give you a little bit of definitional stuff. So the author talks about deconstruction and reconstruction of race. So we can talk about construction and deconstruction of race, of gender, of class, of a lot of different things. In this case, we're talking about race. So what the author means is that, historically we've constructed these ideas about race and in some ways been unchecked, that it gets taken for granted, it gets taken as truth. So it used to be in the past, for example, people, let's go back like 50 years, 60 years ago to make it just even the contrast even greater. People believe certain things about race. There was just sort of this biologically inherent thing that certain groups were just biologically different in certain ways, less intelligent, less smart, less, more physically capable, more prone to acting on their urges. They're biologically determined to be different things. Well, today we've deconstructed that and seen the myth behind that, or the scientific racism behind that, and now we've reconstructed different models of race that are more accurate, more objective, and also more humanizing in the same time. So deconstruction is to take some ways of viewing things that we've come to seem as natural, maybe, deconstruct it, ask questions about it, ask questions about what's the evidence for, what's the support for that, why are we thinking about it in that particular way, and then maybe reconstruct it in a way that is based more on more objective information, more evidence, and it's also more humanizing. The author also uses the idea of ideological state apparatus. So ideology is belief, and then state apparatus has a lot of kind of power to it, this idea that ideology comes through the beliefs that we have in society. For example, in my intro class, we talk a lot about meritocracy, we talk about social class, talk about the American myth of rugged individualism, pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. That ideology comes through a lot of different institutions. It comes through our family and our connections, our friends and people in our own networks, but also comes through ideological state apparatuses. So where it's basically the media is a ideological factory. So it's a way of communicating values and beliefs to the general population, right? And so that's just a term to sort of think about. It's like, where do our beliefs and values either come from or being supported by or being reinforced by? It's through these institutions. And the author focuses a lot on structural kind of things, institutions, structural, institutional things. Could be regulations, rules, practices within an institution, and their impact. And raises the question of whether or not increasing the number of people of color or of minorities within the institution of the media would have, what kind of impact that would have. Because the media or the industry, the institution itself, is being shaped by and has to respond to the logic of capitalism itself. So this becomes the inherent problem: is that capitalism is after certain things. Those things that capitalism is after in terms of markets may be achieved through distortions, through narrowing the field of information, narrowing the topics and stories that are being told, shaping the stories that are being told, and doing that in very particular ways that are reinforcing particular inequalities. So that's an important thing to consider as well. And then wondering about the degree of autonomy of individuals and groups to actually shape things. That the culture industry has a lot of power beyond the individuals that are there, right? So the author uses the example that an artist, a music artist, they have a freedom when they're more autonomous. Now they provide their product to a major label. That label is going to exert a lot of influence on their autonomy. That's just the nature of that tension that's going on there. All right, and finally, you have 3 different films you can choose from to make applications of these theories and ideas. I think I really want you to focus and go back and look over the Birmingham School of the Cultural Studies article as well. It's an important thing to look at these 3 areas: the text itself, the audience reception, and then the production component, and understand those 3 areas of culture. And think about those and think about the theories as you watch and apply those ideas to one of the films, either Sneakerheads, which has to do with basically a subculture of people who are collecting sneakers. And I mean, it's a big subculture, and it's fascinating as a subculture component. And then the other 2 films, Playing Unfair, is looking at gender equity in sports or gender inequity in sports. I think that there's a lot of good food for thought in that one. And then Latinos Beyond Real, about representations of Latinos in Hollywood and film. All right, so that's it for the week. Hope everything's going well. If you have questions, let me know. Or if you just want to talk about sociology, you're on campus, stop on by sometime, give me a phone call. Or if you want to set up an appointment for a phone call, be happy to do that as well. Have yourself a great day. Have yourself a great week. Peace to you all, and take care.